The Victorian age is often remembered for its rigid manners, grand architecture, and endless rules of etiquette. But when one looks closer at how men and women actually met, spoke, and fell in love, the picture becomes far more complicated. Imagine, if you will, a London street in the 1860s, gas lamps flickering in the evening fog, the sound of carriage wheels clattering against cobblestones, ladies in long dresses sweeping past in groups, their chaperones hovering watchfully, and young gentlemen standing straighter than soldiers as they tried to catch a fleeting glance. Dating, as we might call it today, did not exist in the same way. There were courtships, there were introductions, there were long walks carefully observed by family members. But there was no casual meeting without purpose. Every encounter carried weight. A young man who bowed to a lady at a dance was not only acknowledging her presence, but also declaring to her family, to the other guests, and sometimes to the entire neighborhood that he was considering her as a potential partner in life. This seriousness made romance both thrilling and suffocating. Many young women, especially those of the middle class, dreamed of love but knew that their choices were limited by fortune, by class, by what their parents demanded. A poor seamstress might lock eyes with a wealthy clerk, but unless fortune intervened, her gaze would remain only a dream. On the other hand, a gentleman might long for the laughter of a spirited girl, but if her dowry was too small or her reputation uncertain, he risked ruin by pursuing her. Love was often measured not only in heartbeats, but also in coins, in property, and in the whispers of society. To understand this world, we must step into it. Let us follow the story of a few individuals. For history is never lived in generalities, but in the particular days of particular people. Imagine Margaret, the daughter of a respectable but not wealthy bookseller in Bloomsbury. She was 19, clever with words, fond of reading poetry by candlelight, and yet painfully aware that her future depended not on her wit, but on whether she could attract a suitor of stable income. Her mother reminded her constantly that beauty faded, that charm mattered, but that a man's salary was the true measure of happiness. Margaret herself sometimes dreamed of marrying for love alone, yet the stern look in her mother's eyes each morning reminded her of the reality. One autumn evening, Margaret attended a neighborhood gathering, not a grand ball, for her family could not afford such splendor, but a modest tea party in the drawing room of a family friend. The carpets were worn but clean, the piano slightly out of tune, the cups chipped but polished. Yet within this simple setting, hearts beat just as wildly as in the gilded halls of the wealthy. Young men shuffled nervously, offering small compliments, and young women tried to appear both modest and graceful. A balance as delicate as walking a tightrope. At this gathering was also Edward, the son of a clerk at a shipping company. His family was of modest means, but his father had steady work, and Edward's own prospects were considered respectable enough. He was not strikingly handsome, but his earnestness gave him a kind of quiet dignity. He noticed Margaret as she bent over the piano, her fingers hesitant on the keys, her profile lit by the lamplight. To Edward, she seemed like a heroine out of one of the novels he secretly read at his desk during lunch breaks. The two were introduced by the hostess, under the watchful eye of Margaret's mother. Their conversation began awkwardly, with remarks about the weather, the quality of the tea, the latest news from Parliament. Yet beneath the surface, each was aware of the significance. This was not idle chatter. Every word was weighed. Was he steady? Was she gentle? Could this lead to something more? Edward tried to hide his nervousness by speaking of books, a subject dear to him. And to his relief, Margaret's eyes lit up. They discovered a shared love for Tennyson's verses, for Shakespeare's plays. And in that moment, something delicate but undeniable began to take root. And yet, nothing was simple. Margaret's mother whispered later that Edward's income might not suffice, that clerks were plentiful and easily dismissed, that Margaret should aim higher if she hoped to secure comfort. Edward, meanwhile, confessed to his father that the girl he met had stirred his heart, but he worried whether he could provide enough to make her family accept him. Both felt the tug of affection, but both were bound by the invisible chains of Victorian society, chains of duty, of money, of reputation. This was the essence of Victorian romance, a dance not only of hearts, but of expectations. To meet someone was not merely to enjoy a conversation. It was to weigh the future, to calculate risks, to hope against hope that love and fortune might walk hand in hand. For some, it worked. For many, it did not. Yet in that fragile space between desire and duty, stories were lived that shaped entire generations. Margaret returned home from the gathering that night with her cheeks still warm, though whether from the coal fire in the parlor or from the memory of Edward's earnest eyes, she could not tell. The streets of Bloomsbury were quiet as her family's modest carriage rolled over the stones, the fog curling like pale fingers around the lamplight. She sat opposite her mother, who said little, but whose silence was heavy with thought. Margaret's father, weary from a day spent among books and ledgers, dozed beside them, unaware of the delicate storm brewing in his daughter's heart. When they reached their narrow townhouse, Margaret climbed the creaking stairs to her room. She lit a candle and sat at her small writing desk, gazing at the flame as if it might whisper answers. On the shelf above were her beloved volumes, a worn copy of Idylls of the King, a small collection of Keats's poems, and a Bible her grandmother had given her. She opened a notebook, the pages half filled with verses she dared not show anyone. That night she tried to write, but her pen hovered uselessly. Instead, she found herself sketching the outline of a young man's face, not precise, but enough to recall Edward's sincerity. Yet, the next morning, reality returned with her mother's voice. "Margaret," she said as they breakfasted on tea and stale bread, "you must not let yourself be carried away. Mr. Harrington, you remember him, the grocer's son with a position in banking, will attend the bishop's dinner next week. That is the sort of young man who could ensure you a comfortable home. A clerk's son may have kind eyes, but kind eyes do not put food on the table." Margaret lowered her gaze. To argue with her mother was both futile and dangerous. Still, in her heart she thought, what is the use of bread without joy? Edward, meanwhile, returned to his own lodgings, a rented room above a cobbler's shop near Holborn. The walls were thin, the ceiling low, but the space was his. He sat at the small table, spreading out his accounts. His wages were steady but hardly generous. He calculated what he might save each month if he denied himself small luxuries, a new coat, an evening at the music hall, even a book or two. He wondered if, by saving for years, he might present himself as a suitable husband. The thought both excited and tormented him. Days passed, and London, vast and restless, paid little heed to the tender struggles of two young souls. The carriages clattered, the factories roared. The river carried its burden of ships and refused a light. Yet within this great city, hundreds of stories like Margaret's and Edward's unfolded quietly, hidden in parlors, in tea rooms, and the exchanged glances of strangers passing beneath the same fog. At last came the bishop's dinner. Margaret had been prepared carefully. Her mother hired a seamstress to alter a gown, so that it looked new, though Margaret herself knew every stitch had once belonged to her elder cousin. Her hair was arranged tightly, her gloves spotless though thin at the fingertips. She entered the grand house with her parents, heart sinking as she compared herself to other young ladies draped in silk and jewels. The dinner was a display of wealth and rank. Candles glittered in crystal chandeliers. Footmen moved like shadows bearing trays of silver, and the bishop presided with solemn dignity. Conversations drifted from colonial trade to the latest scandal in the newspapers. Margaret sat stiffly, trying to appear both attentive and graceful. It was there she met Mr. Harrington. He was polite, even handsome, with neatly combed hair and a confident smile. He spoke of banking, of investments, of profits made from railroads and ships. Her mother's eyes gleamed with approval each time he addressed Margaret. Yet Margaret's own heart felt cold. His words were like coins falling on a table, bright, but without warmth. Later that evening, when the music began, Harrington offered his hand for a dance. Margaret could not refuse. They moved together across the polished floor, but she felt more like a figure in a game than a partner in a dance. His compliments were rehearsed, his gaze more upon her dress than upon her soul. She smiled politely, but inside she longed for the earnest, awkward conversation she had shared with Edward only days before. When the evening ended and she returned home, her mother praised Harrington endlessly. Margaret smiled faintly but said nothing. She climbed to her room once more, removed her gloves, and looked at her ink-stained fingers. The memory of Edward's shy discussion of Shakespeare returned, and she whispered to herself, "Security is not the same as happiness for Edward." Those same nights were filled with toil. He stayed late at the office, hoping to impress his employer. He copied ledgers until his eyes ached, hoping that diligence might earn him a promotion. At the tavern below his lodgings, laughter and music often drifted upward, tempting him. But he remained at his desk, pen scratching, heart restless. One evening, as he closed his book, he made a quiet vow. He would not let himself be dismissed as just another clerk. He would fight for a place worthy of Margaret's hand, even if it meant years of sacrifice. Thus, to young people lay awake in the heart of London, she torn between duty and longing. He torn between poverty and hope. Around them, the vast city rolled on, indifferent to their dreams, yet filled with countless other hearts beating the same anxious rhythm. The city of London was a vast stage upon which thousands of dramas played out each day. And yet for Margaret and Edward, it often felt as though the entire weight of the metropolis bore down on their narrow worlds. The fog that clung to the river seemed not only a feature of weather, but a symbol of the uncertainty that clouded their futures. Margaret's days followed a rhythm that was both comfortable and suffocating. In the morning, she helped her father in the bookshop, dusting the shelves, arranging the latest periodicals, and carefully setting volumes of poetry or history so that customers might be enticed. The shop smelled of ink, leather, and paper, and though business was modest, her father treated each customer as though they were the noblest of scholars. Margaret loved the shop, loved the texture of the warm bindings beneath her fingers, and often escaped into the stories when no one was watching. But she also knew the limits of their life. The shop barely sustained them, and her mother's constant reminders made it clear that the family's hope of improvement lay in Margaret's marriage. Her mother, Mrs. Whitmore, lived in a world of calculation. Each day she spoke of eligible men as though they were entries in an account book. She noted who had purchased a new carriage, who had been promoted at the bank, who was seen in whose company. To her, courtship was not romance but strategy, and she was determined that Margaret would not squander her chance. Edward, meanwhile, walked a different path. Each morning he rose early, long before the city was fully awake, and trudged through streets where milkmen called, and street sweepers cleared the debris of the night. His office was a narrow room lined with desks, where young men bent over ledgers under the eye of a senior clerk, who ruled with a mixture of sternness and weary humor. The air smelled of ink and damp wool, and the sound of scratching pens was broken only by the cough of a fellow worker, or the occasional bark correction. Edward worked diligently, yet he felt the confines of the place pressing on him. He longed not only for better wages but for meaning, for the chance to step outside the endless columns of numbers and live in a way that mattered. And yet, each time, he thought of Margaret, her dark eyes, her soft voice. He found strength to endure. London itself framed their days. Horse-drawn omnibuses rattled along the Strand. Costermongers shouted their wares in the markets. Beggars huddled at the corners, and ladies with parasols hurried along the pavements. The city was a place of grandeur and misery, where the perfume of a duchess might mingle with the stench of refuse, where the clatter of fine carriages passed starving children. It was in this restless chaos that Margaret and Edward tried to carve their paths. One Sunday, Margaret accompanied her mother to church. The bells tolled, summoning the faithful, and families filed into the pews in orderly rows. The sermon was long and moralizing, filled with warnings about temptation and duty. Margaret listened with half her mind, the other drifting to the memory of Edward's conversation. When the service ended, she lingered by the door, scanning the crowd. And there he was. Edward stood awkwardly near the entrance, hat in hand. As though uncertain whether to approach, their eyes met. And in that instant the church, the crowd, even the judgmental eyes of their neighbors seemed to vanish. He stepped forward, bowed slightly, and murmured a greeting. Mrs. Whitmore immediately tightened her grip on Margaret's arm. Suspicion sharp in her gaze. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," Edward said, voice steady though his hands trembled slightly. "Good morning, Mr. Turner," Margaret replied, her cheeks warming. The exchange was brief, hardly more than a few words, yet to both it felt like a promise. To Mrs. Whitmore, however, it was a warning. That evening she spoke with Margaret at length, insisting that a gentleman of higher prospects must be pursued. Margaret listened silently, but her heart rebelled. For Edward, that meeting was enough to kindle resolve. He began to stay even later at the office, hoping to catch the eye of his superiors. He sought out opportunities, volunteering for extra tasks, taking on the work others avoided. Slowly, his diligence was noticed. One senior clerk remarked that young Turner had a head for figures and the patience of a monk. Edward swallowed his pride, but allowed himself a flicker of hope. Meanwhile, in the Whitmore household, tension grew. Margaret's younger sister, Clara, observed with keen curiosity. Unlike Margaret, Clara was more practical, less inclined to poetry and dreams. She teased her sister gently, whispering, "You look at that clerk as though he were Tennyson himself. Be careful, Mama's eyes are sharper than any detective's." Margaret laughed weakly, but the truth in Clara's words weighed on her. The weeks rolled on, and every glance, every polite bow at church, every accidental encounter in the street, Margaret and Edward wove a thread that grew stronger though still fragile. They exchanged no letters. Such boldness would have been scandalous, yet their silences spoke more than words. Around them, London pressed forward. A factory fire in Whitechapel, a scandal in Parliament, a new novel published by Dickens. All these captured the city's attention. But for two young souls, the greatest drama was not in the headlines, but in the quiet pulse of hope and fear that bound them. And so the stage was set. A young woman torn between duty and desire. A young man fighting against poverty to prove himself. And a city vast enough to crush them, yet intimate enough to bring them face to face again and again. The weeks that followed were filled with a strange mixture of anticipation and dread for Margaret. Each day seemed both brighter and heavier. Brighter because of the possibility of encountering Edward again. Heavier because of her mother's constant reminders that a future with him was unthinkable. London itself seemed to echo her emotions, its streets bustling with life, yet wrapped in fog that obscured everything beyond a few paces. She found herself writing more often in her hidden notebook. The verses she once wrote only for herself began to turn into reflections on love and choice, though she never dared show them to anyone. What is duty without joy? One line asked. What is safety without the warmth of a heart? Another passage described the fog on the Thames as if it were the very embodiment of her doubt. Beautiful, soft, but suffocating Edward, meanwhile, pushed himself harder than ever. His fingers were stained permanently with ink. His back ached from long hours bent over the desk. Yet in his mind he repeated Margaret's name like a prayer. At times he feared he was foolish, that she might forget him entirely, swept away by some polished gentleman with a fortune. But then he remembered the spark in her eyes when they had spoken of poetry, and that memory was enough to fuel another week of labor. Life in the city pressed on relentlessly. The cries of street vendors selling roasted chestnuts, the clang of blacksmiths, the rattle of carriage wheels, the smell of horse dung mingling with fresh bread from bakeries. All of it wove together into the symphony of London. The contrast was everywhere. Beggars shivering under bridges, while elegant ladies adjusted their silk gowns before entering carriages. Children barefoot in the mud while gentlemen in top hats debated politics in coffee houses. This was the world in which love stories were forced to find their way. At a dinner one evening, Margaret's family was joined by neighbors, the wealthy Harringtons. Mr. Harrington, the young banker her mother favored, sat beside Margaret and spoke again of his career, of profits, of how London was the center of the world's wealth. His voice was steady, his manners flawless, but Margaret's heart wandered. She found herself glancing at the door, half expecting Edward to walk in, though she knew he never would. Later, when the evening ended, Clara teased her again. "You look at Harrington as though he were a column of numbers in Papa's ledger. You never smile at him. Do you not see that he is already half in love with you?" Margaret sighed, gazing out the window at the fog. "Perhaps he loves the idea of me, but I cannot give him what he seeks, for my heart does not stir." Clara shook her head. "You speak like a poet. Be careful. Poets often starve." The mention of poets was almost prophetic, for in another part of the city, a young man named Samuel lived precisely such a life. Samuel had grown up the son of a tailor, but his passion had never been for measuring cloth or cutting patterns. Instead, he filled his notebooks with verses, pouring his heart into sonnets and ballads that few ever read. By day he worked in his father's shop, his hands guiding needles and fabric. By night, he sat by the faint glow of a candle, scribbling until his eyes burned. His family considered him impractical, and his neighbors mocked him. Yet Samuel believed that words could feed the soul even if they could not feed the body. He had published a few poems in a small paper, earning pennies, but his dream was to find someone who would not laugh at his devotion to art. One cold evening, fate brought him to a small literary gathering in a cramped room above a tavern near Fleet Street. There, amidst the smoke and the clatter of mugs, he recited a poem he had written about the loneliness of the city. His voice was unsteady at first, but as he spoke, it grew firmer. And among the listeners was a young woman who had come not for poetry, but for escape, Eleanor, a wealthy merchant's daughter, chafing under the constraints of her gilded cage. Eleanor's life had been one of luxury but little freedom. Her dresses were of the finest silk, her meals served on silver. But her days were measured by her father's expectations and society's demands. She had been told since childhood that she would marry well, that her beauty was an asset to be bartered. Yet she longed for something beyond carriages and soirees. When she heard Samuel's poem, raw and unpolished, it struck her more deeply than all the rehearsed compliments she had received in ballrooms. After the reading, she approached him. "Your words," she said softly, "sound like truth, and truth is rare in this city." Samuel, unused to attention from someone of her class, could barely reply. But that night, as Eleanor returned to her family's grand house and Samuel to his candlelit garret, both carried a spark of something new. Thus, within the great city, two parallel stories unfolded: Margaret and Edward, bound by love yet trapped by circumstance; Eleanor and Samuel, drawn together across the chasm of wealth and class. London, indifferent yet strangely generous, held them all in its fog and fire. The winter of 1851 pressed down on London with a kind of relentless dignity. The fog was heavier than ever, rolling in from the Thames like a living curtain that swallowed whole streets, muffled footsteps, and turned the gaslight into pale orbs hanging in the gloom. It was in such a season that the Whitmores received an invitation to the Harringtons' grand ball. For Mrs. Whitmore, it was nothing short of providence. "Margaret, you must wear the blue silk," she insisted, rummaging through trunks as though the fabric itself might decide her daughter's fate. "It brings out the light in your eyes, and when Mr. Harrington asks you to dance, you must smile, not too wide, mind you, but enough to let him see your sweetness. A girl must never look desperate, only gracious." Margaret listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Inside her chest, Her heart thudded with dread. She imagined the glittering chandeliers, the perfume of roses masking the stench of hundreds of candles, the endless parade of gentlemen bowing with rehearsed charm. She also imagined Edward, alone in his narrow office, still hunched over his ledgers while she was paraded like a prize horse. The thought left her restless. The night of the ball arrived with icy winds rattling the carriage windows. As the Whitmores traveled across the city, the Harrington house was ablaze with light, each window glowing, each doorway flanked by liveried servants. Inside, the grand hall stretched upward, crystal chandeliers scattering light across polished floors where ladies in satin and gentlemen in black coats mingled with the confidence of those who believed the world existed for their pleasure. Music filled the air, violins and cellos playing, waltzes that seemed to float above the chatter. Margaret entered at her mother's side, and heads turned, not only because of her beauty, but because the Whitmores were known to be respectable yet modest. To many, Margaret was a puzzle, to refine for the lower classes, to poor for the highest. Mr. Harrington soon appeared, bowing low. His manners were flawless, his words practiced. He led Margaret to the dance floor, and they waltzed in perfect rhythm. Yet as she moved through the steps, Margaret felt as though her very soul stood still. She smiled when he spoke of his investments, nodded when he remarked on Parliament. But inside she longed for Edward's earnestness, his unpolished yet genuine conversation. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, Eleanor sat cloaked in a plain shawl, waiting in the shadow of St. Dunstan's Church. Her carriage had delivered her to a respectable dinner earlier that evening, but she had feigned illness, slipped away, and now stood trembling with both fear and exhilaration. The bells tolled the hour, echoing across narrow alleys, and at last Samuel appeared. His steps hurried, his hair damp from the fog. "You came," he whispered, as though astonished. "I had to," Eleanor replied, her voice both fragile and defiant. "Do you know how long I have listened to men who speak and never mean it? And then you come, with your verses, your truth. It is as though I had been starving and suddenly remembered what bread tastes like." Samuel's throat tightened. He had never been compared to bread before, yet he understood. He took her hand, rough with calluses from sewing in his father's shop, and for a moment, class and circumstance dissolved. They spoke of books, of dreams, of London itself, not the grand London of mansions and carriages, but the living, breathing city of cobblestones and cries, of hunger and hope. Eleanor confessed that she often envied the freedom of washerwomen who sang as they worked, for even their hard labor seemed more honest than the empty smiles she endured at soirees. As they spoke, the city went on around them. A drunkard stumbled from a tavern, a watchman's lantern swung through the mist, and the cries of a fishmonger echoed faintly from the river. Yet to them, the night seemed carved out of time. Back at the Harrington ball, Margaret endured dance after dance. When she was finally able to slip away into the conservatory, she stood among the ferns and orchids, breathing heavily as though she had run a mile. The glass panes were fogged with condensation, the air heavy with the scent of earth and blossoms. For the first time that evening, she allowed herself to close her eyes and imagine Edward's hand in hers, his voice reading poetry in the quiet of her father's bookshop. It was then that Clara found her. "You look as though you've seen a ghost," she teased, though her tone softened when she saw her sister's expression. "Perhaps I have," Margaret whispered. "The ghost of the life I might live." Clara studied her carefully. "You cannot speak such things aloud. Mama would faint, but I understand. I may not believe in poetry as you do, but I see that it believes in you." Margaret clasped her sister's hand. For a moment, the grand ball, with all its glitter and pretension, seemed far away. And so the city stories wove themselves together. In one quarter, the brilliance of chandeliers and the suffocation of duty. In another, the quiet rebellion of a wealthy girl meeting a poor poet in the mist. London was a tapestry of contradictions, and within it, Margaret, Edward, Eleanor, and Samuel each carried their fragile threads, uncertain where they would lead. The morning after, Eleanor nodded obediently. but inside she rebelled. That night she slipped into her diary a pressed flower Samuel had given her. After their second clandestine meeting, a humble wild daisy plucked from the roadside, against the polished silver and pearls of her household. That daisy seemed more precious than any jewel. Samuel, too, felt the weight of their secret. His father grew impatient with his distracted work. His neighbors whispered about his late-night wanderings, and even his own conscience sometimes asked whether he was leading Eleanor into danger. Yet each time he saw her, all doubts dissolved. Her laughter, rare but genuine, seemed to wash away the grime of the city itself. London was a city of stories, and not all of them hopeful. In the alley behind the Whitmore's shop lived the Baker family, tenants whose lives bore the scars of poverty. Mrs. Baker, once a lively woman, now worked herself to exhaustion as a seamstress, while her husband, crippled in an accident at the docks, could only limp through odd jobs. Their eldest daughter, Annie, was 16, the same age as Clara. Unlike Clara, Annie had little chance of books or leisure. Each morning she carried baskets of laundry for wealthier households. Her hands chapped raw from the cold water, yet she sang as she worked, her voice carrying through the alley with surprising sweetness. Margaret often watched her from the window of the bookshop and felt humbled. Though Annie's life was marked by hardship, she seemed to carry herself with a resilience Margaret admired. One afternoon, Margaret gave her a small book of poems, quietly pressing it into her hands. Annie's eyes widened as though she had been given a crown. "I cannot read well," she confessed shyly, "but my brother will help me." The encounter stayed with Margaret, reminding her that love and dignity were not the sole privileges of the wealthy. As weeks turned into months, the threads of these lives tangled more tightly. Edward struggled for advancement at his firm, staying late until the lamps burned low. He earned a grudging respect from his superiors, though promotions were scarce and competition fierce. Margaret endured her mother's endless schemes, each suitor more insistent than the last. Eleanor continued her secret meetings with Samuel, each encounter more dangerous as her father's suspicions sharpened. And in the background, London loomed, its carriages rattling, its factories smoking, its countless souls striving, failing, surviving. Then came the night of the Wilkinson supper. Eleanor attended under her father's watchful eye, her gown glittering with sequins. The drawing room was stifling, filled with laughter and the clink of glasses. Suitors approached her with rehearsed compliments, yet her heart was far away. With Samuel's simple words still echoing, "Truth is rare in this city." As she raised her glass of champagne, her gaze fell upon a daisy tucked into her sleeve. It was hidden from the crowd, but to her, it was more radiant than all the jewels in the room. And across the city, Edward sat at his desk in the dim light, his pen scratching across paper not for the firm, but for himself. He wrote Margaret's name at the top of a page, then hesitated, then began a letter he dared not send. His words spilled out, of hope, of fear, of the simple wish to hold her hand. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, locking it away. Perhaps one day he would be bold enough to deliver it. London's fog pressed against the windows of ballrooms and garrets alike. It shrouded the carriages of the rich and the footsteps of the poor. And within that fog, for young lives searched for meaning, Margaret and Edward, Eleanor and Samuel, each fighting not only against society, but against the doubts within their own hearts. The first weeks of spring brought both renewal and unrest to London. The river, no longer locked in frost, carried barges heavy with goods, while markets overflowed with early produce from the countryside. Yet alongside this life came tension. A series of small fires had broken out near Whitechapel, destroying rows of overcrowded tenements. And talk of negligence and greed swirled in the newspapers. Crowds gathered on corners, debating whether landlords or careless tenants were to blame. For Edward, the fires were more than a headline. One of his colleagues had a cousin who lived in the Burn district, and the man came to the office pale and shaken, describing how families had poured into the streets with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Edward listened, his heart tight. Poverty was no abstract concept to him. It was the air he breathed every day. Yet hearing of such devastation reminded him how fragile their lives were, how easily one spark could erase everything. That night, as he left the office, he wandered toward the river instead of returning straight home. The air smelled of smoke even miles from Whitechapel, and in the distance he saw the faint glow where embers still smoldered. He thought of Margaret, safe in her home, yet not immune to danger. What if someday she too were left homeless, her family's shop consumed by fire? The thought filled him with urgency. He could not remain a clerk forever. Margaret, meanwhile, felt the pressure of her mother's plans tightening like a noose. Suitors multiplied with the spring season. At teas and dinners, her mother contrived to place her in the company of respectable gentlemen, bankers, solicitors, even a young barrister with a sharp wit and sharper ambition. They spoke well, dressed finely, and looked at her as though assessing a purchase. Each smile she offered felt like a betrayal of her heart. One evening, after enduring yet another tedious supper, Margaret slipped into her father's bookshop to find solace. She ran her fingers along the spines of the volumes until she reached a worn copy of Milton's Paradise Lost. Opening it at random, her eyes fell on the line, "The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell." A hell of heaven. The word struck her with cruel truth. Was she not living precisely such a conflict, torn between duty and desire? Her younger sister Clara found her there, candle in hand. "Mama is furious," she whispered, half amused, half worried. "She says you embarrassed Mr. Harrington by excusing yourself so suddenly." Margaret closed the book gently. "Better his pride wounded than my soul crushed." Clara stared at her, then laughed softly. "You sound more like a revolutionary than a lady elsewhere in the city." Eleanor's secret meetings with Samuel became ever more perilous. Twice she had nearly been discovered, once by a watchman who eyed them suspiciously, once by her own maid, who covered for her but warned that whispers might spread. Yet Eleanor's defiance grew rather than diminished. One foggy night, she confessed her turmoil to Samuel. "If my father discovers us, he will banish you from the city if he can, and me. He will lock me away until I bend to his will. But still I come. Do you think me mad?" Samuel took her hands firmly. "If it is madness, then I share it gladly. They may strip me of everything, but not of the words I write for you. You have made my verses real." She pressed her forehead against his, tears burning her eyes. In that moment, the whole machinery of society, wealth, reputation, duty, felt distant and powerless compared to the warmth of his hands. But the city had a way of intruding. News of the Whitechapel fires reached Eleanor's household, and her father used it as another example in his endless life. The Whitmores were invited through the Harringtons' influence, for Mrs. Whitmore saw every event as another chance to advance Margaret's prospects. "It is not only charity," she told her daughter as she adjusted the lace of her gown, "but opportunity. Remember that generous hearts often come with generous incomes." Margaret bit her lip, resisting the urge to protest. She thought of the burned tenements, of Annie Baker's cracked hands, and wondered how many of the wealthy patrons truly cared for such suffering. Edward, astonishingly, was also present, not as a guest, but as part of his firm's duties. The company had contributed funds, and Edward was tasked with delivering documents and ensuring their donation was properly acknowledged. To him, the glittering room felt almost unreal. He stood near the edges, quill and ledger in hand, watching as lords and ladies praised themselves for their benevolence while sipping champagne. The evening began with speeches. A politician thundered about civic duty, a bishop prayed for the afflicted, and applause rippled through the hall. Then came the moment when donations were announced, each family's name read aloud. Their contributions met with murmurs of approval or envy. Edward's firm was listed among them, though his own name was, of course, absent. It was during the intermission that fate arranged its threads. Margaret, seeking a breath of air, wandered toward a quieter corner of the hall. Edward, carrying papers to a steward, nearly collided with her. For an instant, both froze, the world around them dimming. "Mr. Turner," she whispered, her voice trembling yet steady enough to pass for politeness. "Miss Whitmore," he replied, bowing slightly. Though his heart pounded so loudly, he feared she might hear it. They exchanged only a few words, yet within them lay volumes. Margaret's eyes spoke of longing, Edward's of resolve. Neither dared linger, for Mrs. Whitmore's gaze swept the room like a hawk's. But the encounter renewed their fragile bond. Meanwhile, across the hall, Eleanor Ashford sat beside her father, listening as he boasted of his donation. "It is not merely charity," he declared to his companions, "but an investment in stability. When the poor are soothed, they are less likely to riot." Eleanor's stomach turned at his words. She excused herself under the pretense of fatigue and slipped toward the back of the hall. There, by the servant's entrance, she found Samuel. He had come not as a guest, but as part of the humble staff assisting with arrangements. His father's tailoring shop had been asked to provide alterations for some of the gowns, and Samuel carried garments in his arms. Their eyes met, and though they dared not speak, Eleanor felt her heart surge. In the brief brush of their hands as he passed her a shawl, more truth was spoken than in all the evening's grand speeches. The night wore on. Music resumed, couples danced, and the wealthy congratulated themselves while the poor remained in ashes. Yet in that room of mirrors and chandeliers, for young souls glimpsed both the cruelty and the possibility of their world. Margaret returned home more determined than ever to resist her mother's plans. Edward lay awake, clutching the unsent letter in his drawer, imagining a day when he might stand openly at her side. Eleanor wrote furiously in her diary, vowing never to surrender her heart to wealth's prison. And Samuel, exhausted from carrying burdens both literal and invisible, whispered to himself that love, though fragile, could outshine even the brightest chandeliers. London slept beneath its blanket of fog, but within that fog, quiet fires of defiance burned. London, ever restless, was a city that thrived on coincidence, streets twisted like veins, drawing together people who might otherwise have lived entire lives apart. And so it was that, one damp April morning, paths began to converge. Margaret had been sent on an errand to deliver a package of books to a gentleman near Chancery Lane. It was rare for her mother to allow such independence, but Mrs. Whitmore was preoccupied with planning another dinner, and Margaret seized the chance for escape. Cloaked in a modest shawl, she walked briskly, her heart lightened by the simple act of moving unchaperoned through the city. The streets were alive with noise, costermongers crying their wares, children darting between carts, the distant toll of bells. Margaret drank it in greedily, each sound a reminder that life existed beyond the narrow confines of drawing rooms and supper tables. Turning a corner, she nearly collided with a man carrying a stack of papers. Ink stains marked his fingers, and his hat was pulled low against the drizzle. It was Edward. For an instant, both froze, staring at one another as if conjured by thought alone. "Forgive me, Miss Whitmore," Edward said quickly, bowing. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed a storm of emotion. "There is nothing to forgive." "Mr. Turner," Margaret replied, her cheeks flushed with more than the chill air. They stood awkwardly, words trembling on their lips, until Margaret finally whispered, "I am glad to see you well." "And I you," Edward answered, "more glad than I can say." A passerby jostled them, breaking the fragile moment. Margaret adjusted her shawl, painfully aware that anyone might recognize her. "I must go," she murmured. "As must I," Edward said, though his eyes lingered. "But perhaps one day, when chance is kinder." She nodded, unable to trust her voice, and hurried on. Yet the memory of his presence clung to her, warmer than the shawl around her shoulders. Meanwhile, Eleanor Ashford endured another of her father's endless social calls. He insisted she accompany him to a meeting with his shipping partner near the docks. Eleanor detested the smell of tar and brine, the shouts of dock workers, the looming masts like forest trunks. but she endured with practiced grace. While her father conversed loudly with the merchant, Eleanor slipped a few steps away, drawn by the sight of a group of children playing with makeshift toys on the wharf. Their clothes were ragged, their faces smudged with soot, yet their laughter rang bright against the gray water. She smiled faintly, thinking how Samuel would capture such a moment in verse. As if the thought had summoned him, she glimpsed a familiar figure across the street, Samuel, delivering a parcel of mended coats for his father's shop. Their eyes met. Eleanor's heart jolted, but she dared not move. Samuel gave the smallest nod, a gesture almost invisible, yet filled with meaning. For the rest of the day, the echo of the glance carried her through her father's lectures. The city seemed determined to weave these threads tighter. That evening, a sudden downpour sent crowds rushing for shelter near St. Paul's. Margaret, having lingered too long at her errand, found herself pressed into the same colonnade where Edward had paused to escape the rain. Across the square, Samuel darted into a doorway with his bundle, while Eleanor, returning from the docks, guided her maid under the same arch. For a fleeting moment, all four were within sight of one another, unaware, perhaps, of the destinies aligning around them, yet bound by the same storm. The rain hammered on stone, lightning flashing against the great dome. Margaret clutched her parcel of books. Edward held his ink-stained papers. Eleanor shivered beneath her shawl, and Samuel wrung water from his sleeves. Around them, Londoners muttered, cursed, and laughed at the weather. And in that storm, the city itself seemed to pause, as though holding its breath. When the rain at last began to ease, the crowd spilled out from under the colonnade like water from a bursting dam. The stones of the square glistened, reflecting the flicker of gas lamps. Carriages splashed through puddles, their wheels sending fans of dirty water into the air. Street hawkers resumed their cries, and the great dome of St. Paul's glowed pale against the clearing sky. Margaret held her parcel of books tightly, her shawl soaked and heavy. Edward hovered a few steps away, uncertain whether to escort her or vanish into the tide of strangers. He longed to speak, to walk at her side, yet every instinct warned him that one wrong word could ruin her reputation. Then a shout split the air. A horse, startled by thunder still rumbling faintly, reared and bolted across the square. Its carriage swerved violently, the driver struggling with the reins. The crowd screamed, scattering in all directions. Margaret froze in the path of the animal, her feet rooted by fear. The horse's hooves struck sparks against the wet stones as it charged nearer. In that instant, Edward moved. Dropping his papers, he lunged forward, grasped Margaret by the arm, and pulled her clear. They tumbled hard onto the slick pavement, her parcel bursting open, books scattering like startled birds. For a heartbeat, the world was soundless except for her ragged breath. She looked into Edward's face, his hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes wide with fear. Not for himself, but for her. "Are you hurt?" he gasped. "No," she whispered, trembling. "Only shaken." Around them, people rushed to calm the horse. Others gathered the fallen books. Among those who bent to help was Samuel, who had darted forward instinctively from the opposite side of the square. He handed Margaret a damp volume, meeting Edward's gaze with a quick nod of respect. And then Eleanor was there, her maid clinging to her arm, her eyes wide with horror. She pushed through the throng, knelt beside Margaret, and pressed her hand gently to hers. "You are safe," she murmured, though her voice shook. Thank heaven. For the first time, Alfred stood within a circle of crisis, strangers bound by the same moment of peril. The crowd began to disperse, muttering about reckless drivers and dangerous storms. But the connection had been made. Edward helped Margaret to her feet, his hands lingering a second longer than propriety allowed. Samuel, unnoticed by most, tucked one of her books carefully back into the parcel. Eleanor, her cheeks flushed, glanced between them all and felt a strange certainty. Their lives had just crossed in a way none of them could yet understand. That night, the storm left behind not only puddles in the streets, but ripples in their hearts. Margaret lay awake, the memory of Edward's arms pulling her from danger replaying endlessly in her mind. Edward, alone in his small room, whispered her name as though it were both prayer and curse. Eleanor filled pages of her diary, describing the terror of the runaway horse and the courage she had witnessed. Samuel returned to his garret, but before opening his notebook, he whispered aloud in the storm's chaos. The true threads revealed themselves, and beyond the walls of their homes, London rumbled on, oblivious, immense. But for the first time, their separate stories had touched, and nothing would ever be quite the same. News traveled swiftly in London, carried not only by newspapers but by tongues quicker than any press. By the next morning, the incident at St. Paul's, the runaway horse, the scattered books, the gallant young man who leapt to save a lady, had already been embroidered into half a dozen versions. Some said the horse nearly trampled a dozen people. Others claimed the young lady had fainted dramatically into her rescuer's arms. The truth mattered little. What mattered was that a story existed, and stories in London had a way of spreading like wildfire. At breakfast, Mrs. Whitmore unfolded the newspaper with a satisfied smile. "It seems we were fortunate not to be there, Margaret," she remarked, sipping her tea. "Imagine the scandal, a young lady of standing in the middle of such chaos." Margaret kept her eyes on her plate, saying nothing, though her hands trembled slightly. She had not told her mother that she had been there. To confess would mean endless questions, and worse, suspicion about Edward. Clara, however, watched her sister keenly. Later, when they were alone in the bookshop, she whispered, "It was you, wasn't it? You were the lady who nearly got trampled." Margaret's cheeks flushed crimson. "Do not speak of it." "But was it him?" Clara pressed. "The clerk, Mr. Turner." Margaret turned away, arranging books on the shelf with unnecessary vigor. "He acted only from decency. Anyone would have done the same." Yet the warmth in her voice betrayed her. Clara smiled slyly, though not unkindly. "I will keep your secret, but you must be careful. Secrets in London are like smoke. They find cracks to escape." Meanwhile, Edward returned to his office to find himself the subject of teasing. Green, ever watchful for gossip, leaned over his desk with a grin. "I heard you played the hero yesterday, Turner. Rescued some lady in distress. Did you? Was she fair? Will you now be invited to balls with dukes and baronets?" The laughter of their colleagues rang around the room. Edward flushed but kept silent, refusing to confirm or deny. Yet inside, pride and dread warred. He had saved Margaret, but if word reached the wrong ears, she might suffer more than he. Far across the city, Eleanor faced her own storm. Her maid, loyal but anxious, begged her to be cautious. "Miss, if your father discovers you go out at night, or that you meet with Mr. Samuel, it will be ruin. They will send me away, and you." "I dread to think." Eleanor grasped the maid's hand. "I know the risk, but I cannot turn back. For the first time, I feel alive. Do you understand? Not like a doll in a cabinet, but a soul that breathes." The maid's eyes filled with tears. "Then at least let me help you, for I cannot watch you fall alone." Samuel, too, felt the ripple of whispers. In the tavern where poets sometimes gathered, one man sneered, "So, the tailor's son courts a lady of fashion. How long before she tires of playing at romance and leaves you in the gutter?" Samuel clenched his fists but forced himself to remain calm. Later, alone with his notebook, he wrote, "Let them mock. What they call folly, I call truth. And even if truth breaks me, I would rather be broken than hollow." The fire at Whitechapel still smoldered in public memory, and now the drama at St. Paul's added fuel to endless debates in coffee houses and parlors. To some, it was a tale of heroism. To others, a scandal waiting to unfold. Names were not yet attached, but London was a city that thrived on uncovering them. In the days that followed, Margaret noticed subtle changes. At church, she caught whispers behind gloved hands. A neighbor's daughter asked slyly, "Did you see the excitement at St. Paul's? They say the young lady was very brave, or very foolish." Margaret smiled faintly, pretending ignorance, but her stomach knotted with fear at the same time. Edward's responsibilities at work grew heavier. The senior clerk remained ill, and Edward now met with merchants himself, walking the bustling docks, tallying shipments of tea, tobacco, and cloth. The work was exhausting, yet it gave him glimpses of a broader world. Ships arrived from India and the West Indies. Sailors staggered through taverns. Dockside children begged for coins. He saw not only the wealth that fueled London's grandeur, but also the suffering that underpinned it. And in quiet moments, he thought, if I could climb higher, earn enough, I might one day stand beside her without shame. Meanwhile, Eleanor and Samuel's meetings took on a sharper edge of urgency. They no longer lingered in idle talk but spoke of futures. What if we left the city? Samuel asked one night as they walked near the river, where the lamps shimmered on black water. There are towns where no one knows us, where I could teach or write, and you would not be trapped by your father's name. Eleanor's eyes widened with longing, but then she shook her head. He would never allow it. He would drag me back by force. And yet, I dream of it. Their whispered dreams mingled with the sound of the river, carrying them away like fragile boats on a dangerous current. London was vast, but not infinite. Rumors circled tighter, threads drew closer, and as spring ripened, it seemed inevitable that secrets would burst into the open. For no storm remains forever in the shadows. The season's crowning event was the Harringtons' annual spring ball, a night that every ambitious family in London awaited with anticipation and dread in equal measure. Invitations were scarce and coveted, gilded with embossed script that promised entry into the very heart of society. To be seen at the Harringtons meant being measured, weighed, and perhaps advanced rung on the endless ladder of London's hierarchy. The Whitmores, naturally, secured their place. Mrs. Whitmore had spent weeks in anxious preparation, directing seamstresses, bargaining with jewelers, and rehearsing Margaret in the art of polite conversation. Smile, but not too eagerly, she coached, fastening pearls at her daughter's throat. Laugh softly, never too loud. And above all, remember that men of fortune do not seek women of opinions. They seek grace. Margaret endured these lessons in silence, though her heart recoiled from them. She longed not for grace in the eyes of strangers, but for honesty in the eyes of Edward. Edward himself had no thought of attending, yet fate had other designs. His employer's firm was providing discreet financial backing for the Harrington enterprises, and Edward was sent as part of a clerical staff to oversee certain agreements. Signed during the evening, he wore his plainest suit, pressed as neatly as he could manage, and carried with him a stack of ledgers that felt heavier than iron chains. He expected to remain invisible, a shadow among lords and ladies. The Harrington house blazed with light, chandeliers dripped with crystal, footmen hurried to and fro, and a small orchestra filled the air with strains of Mozart and Strauss. Carriages lined the street for blocks, their horses snorting clouds of silver in the cool spring night. Within, the scent of roses mingled with perfumes, and the chatter of 100 voices echoed beneath gilded ceilings. Margaret entered on her mother's arm, her gown of pale silk shimmering under the lights. She looked every inch the lady her mother had sculpted, but beneath the lace and pearls her spirit trembled with unease. She knew Edward might be present in some hidden corner, and the thought both thrilled and terrified her. Eleanor Ashford, too, was there. Though unwillingly, her father paraded her as one might a fine possession, introducing her to wealthy heirs as though she were a prize mare. Eleanor's smile was polished but lifeless. She endured the bows and compliments, but her gaze strayed again and again toward the door, hoping against hope to catch sight of Samuel. Of course, he would not be admitted among such company, not as a guest, but perhaps as a servant, a tradesman. She clung to the possibility like a drowning woman to driftwood. Samuel indeed lingered near, though unseen by most. He had been called to deliver last-minute alterations for a gentleman's coat, and rather than depart at once, he lingered in the service halls, drawn by the sound of music and the faint chance of glimpsing Eleanor. His heart thundered as he slipped among the shadows, catching fleeting glimpses of her through doorways, radiant and untouchable as the evening unfolded. Whispers began to weave through the glittering crowd. The incident at St. Paul's was mentioned with relish, each version more dramatic than the last. A runaway horse, a lady nearly trampled, a daring rescue, cried Lady Somerville, fanning herself vigorously. Why? It sounds like a tale from a novel. Another leaned close, lowering her voice. They say the lady was of good family, and the rescuer, a common clerk. Gasps and titters followed. Eyes darted about the room, hungry to discover the identities. Margaret heard the whispers and felt her knees weaken. Her mother prattled on with acquaintances, oblivious, but Margaret's ears rang with every mention of the tale. She could feel the net drawing tighter, each rumor a thread that might soon bind her name to Edward's Edward. Stationed near a writing desk with his ledgers, heard the same whispers. His face burned. He dared not look toward Margaret, yet every nerve strained toward her presence. He knew that if his part in the story were revealed, her reputation might suffer ruin. And yet, in some hidden chamber of his soul, he felt fierce pride. For once, his name might stand beside hers. However scandalously, the climax of the evening came when the orchestra struck a waltz, and couples swept onto the floor. Margaret was led by a young baronet's son, whose practiced smile concealed calculation. They moved gracefully, yet Margaret felt only the weight of eyes upon her, the suffocating closeness of a world that measured her worth by dowry and demeanor. Across the hall, Edward watched, his hands clenched so tightly around his quill that the nib snapped, ink blotting the page. Eleanor, meanwhile, excused herself from yet another suitor's conversation and slipped quietly toward a side corridor. There, in the half-light, Samuel appeared, his expression torn between joy and dread. "You should not be here," he whispered. "And yet here I am," she replied, her voice fierce with longing. "I cannot breathe in that room without you." They stood close, shadows hiding their clasped hands. But even shadows have ears. A passing servant caught sight of them and hurried away, and in London, no secret remained unspoken for long. Back in the ballroom, Lady Somerville raised her fan, eyes gleaming with triumph. "I have heard it was Miss Whitmore herself who was rescued," she announced loudly enough for half the hall to hear. Heads turned, whispers sharpened, and Margaret felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Her partner stumbled, confused, and all eyes turned toward the pale young woman at the center of the room. Edward half rose, torn between duty and desire, his soul ablaze with the knowledge that silence would doom her, yet speech might doom them both. In that glittering hall, under chandeliers and mirrors, the fragile balance of their lives trembled on the edge of collapse. For a heartbeat after Lady Somerville's announcement, the ballroom was suspended in silence, as if the chandeliers themselves had frozen mid-glitter. Dozens of eyes turned toward Margaret. The music faltered. Even the violinist's bow seemed to hover uncertainly above the strings. Margaret's face blanched. She wanted to deny it, to laugh off the suggestion. But her voice would not come. Every instinct told her that to speak might betray more than silence. Her partner, the baronet's son, stammered, "Surely it is not. Surely this is a mistake." But his eyes darted to her trembling hands, and doubt crept into his voice. Mrs. Whitmore, who until that moment had been basking in society's approval, turned rigid. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her hand clutching her fan so tightly that the ivory cracked. She moved forward swiftly, placing herself at Margaret's side. "Nonsense," she declared with brittle cheer. "My daughter was nowhere near St. Paul's that day. Some gossip monger seeks to tarnish a good family's name." But whispers rippled through the crowd like a rising tide. Lady Somerville, satisfied with the commotion she had caused, leaned back with a smug smile. "Perhaps so," she said sweetly. "And yet the likeness is remarkable. Do you not agree?" Margaret felt her breath shorten. Her eyes flicked involuntarily across the room, and there, Near the desk with ledgers stood Edward. For an instant their gazes locked. It was enough. In the glint of recognition between them, sharp-eyed observers saw confirmation of the rumor. A murmur surged louder. It was her, someone whispered. And that man, yes, the clerk. Gasps followed, half scandalized, half thrilled. The baronet's son released Margaret's hand as though it burned him. He bowed stiffly and retreated. Mrs. Whitmore's face turned a shade paler, though she forced a brittle smile. She gripped Margaret's arm so tightly that it hurt. "You will say nothing," she hissed under her breath. "Smile. Pretend ignorance." Edward, watching the scene unfold, felt his chest constrict. Every fiber of him urged to step forward, to declare that the fault was his, that Margaret bore no blame. Yet he knew that such an admission might ruin her completely. He remained frozen, torn between love and fear, pride and restraint. Meanwhile, in a shadowed corridor, Eleanor and Samuel had not heard the full announcement, but sensed the shift in atmosphere. Laughter had turned sharp, whispers hissed like snakes. Samuel gripped Eleanor's hand. "Something is happening." Eleanor's heart pounded. "Then we must be careful. Every glance, every word tonight could destroy us." Back in the ballroom, the orchestra attempted to resume the waltz, but the music faltered. Too many dancers had withdrawn, choosing instead to cluster in groups. Exchanging hurried speculation, Lord Ashford, Eleanor's father, approached Mrs. Whitmore with calculated politeness. "I hope the rumors do not distress you, madam. Though in truth, one must always expect that where there is smoke, there may be fire." His words dripped with insinuation, and Mrs. Whitmore bristled. "My daughter is above reproach," she snapped, but her voice carried a note of desperation. Margaret felt as though the ground beneath her feet had dissolved. She longed to flee, to escape the crushing weight of scrutiny. But escape was impossible. Every door was watched, every step echoed. She turned once more toward Edward, silently begging him to act, to save her as he had in the square. Edward took one step forward. The decision burned within him. His voice trembled as he began. "It was I." But before he could continue, a steward hurried to his side, whispering urgently about documents that required immediate attention. The interruption shattered his courage. He faltered, and the moment passed. Margaret's shoulders sagged, her hope extinguished. The ball dissolved into fractured fragments of conversation. Some laughed, others consoled, still others plotted how to use the scandal for advantage. By the evening's end, Margaret felt as though she had been paraded naked through the streets. When at last she returned home, Mrs. Whitmore unleashed her fury. "You reckless, thoughtless child," she cried, slamming the door. Samuel wandered the midnight streets, unable to sleep. He passed beggars curled in doorways, drunkards singing off-key, children huddled beneath tattered blankets. To him, the glittering scandal of the ballroom seemed obscene in contrast to the true struggles of the poor. Yet even in the filth of the streets, he carried Eleanor's image like a lantern in the dark. Thus the night ended, each of them wounded, each carrying burdens unseen by the others. And London, vast and indifferent, turned its gears, ready to grind them further in the days to come. But fate was already moving, weaving their lives closer still. The scandal was not the end. It was only the beginning of a reckoning that would touch them all. The scandal of the Harrington Ball did not remain confined to one glittering night. By the following morning, it had seeped into drawing rooms, coffee houses, marketplaces, and taverns. London was a city built upon commerce, but it was fueled equally by gossip. Stories spread not only across districts, but also across classes, each retold with embellishments until truth was drowned in speculation. The newspapers, cautious not to name names, nonetheless hinted broadly. A young lady of fine family rescued by a man of humble birth. Society divided over romance or impropriety. The phrase romance or impropriety was repeated endlessly, in parlors and in pubs, until it became a refrain not in the Whitmore household. The tension was unbearable. Mrs. Whitmore refused to leave the house for 3 days. Claiming illness, though in truth she feared the eyes of her neighbors. When at last she ventured to church, the polite bows she received were tinged with curiosity. Women leaned together to whisper as she passed. Margaret, walking silently at her mother's side, felt every glance like a thorn in her skin. Clara attempted to lighten the mood. Perhaps they will turn it into a novel. She joked softly as they sat in the bookshop one afternoon. The brave clerk, the imperiled lady, the wicked tongues of society. It would sell well. Margaret shook her head, her voice thick with despair. If only it were fiction. But it is my life, Clara, and I feel as though the author has no mercy. Edward, too, found his name circulating in places he least expected. At the docks, merchants nudged each other knowingly when he arrived. There goes the hero, one said with a smirk. Better keep him away from your daughters, or he'll be rescuing them next. The laughter was coarse, but behind it Edward sensed a mix of envy and resentment. He bore it in silence, though his fists clenched at his sides at the office. Green would not relent. A fine match you've made, Turner, he teased daily. Shall we expect wedding bands? Then, perhaps you'll dine with dukes and earls next. Edward ignored him, but each barb left its mark. At night, he stared at the ceiling, torn between longing to see Margaret and fear of destroying her entirely. Eleanor's world grew darker. Her father seized upon the scandal as a warning. Do you see, daughter? This is what happens when women forget their place. The Whitmore girl may never recover. Remember that your worth lies not in passion, but in reputation. He said it with such finality that Eleanor felt her lungs constrict. She scribbled furiously in her diary that night, if love is a crime, then let me be guilty. I will not live as a prisoner gilded in pearls. Samuel, meanwhile, found his nights restless. In the tavern, friends debated the scandal with glee. If the world turned upside down, imagine it, one said. A clerk marrying a lady, a tailor's son with a woman of fortune. Madness. Samuel remained silent, though rage coiled inside him. Later, in solitude, he poured his thoughts onto paper. They laugh because they fear. If a clerk may love a lady, then all their walls crumble. Weeks passed, but the whispers did not fade. They grew. Suitors who once circled Margaret now hesitated. Invitations arrived less frequently. Mrs. Whitmore noticed it all with mounting panic. Do you see, Margaret? She demanded one evening. This is what comes of recklessness. We must repair your name. There is talk of arranging a match swiftly, before the damage becomes permanent. Margaret recoiled. A loveless match, to hide the truth. I would sooner live alone. Her mother's eyes narrowed. Better alone than ruined. But you will obey. Your future is not yours to squander. Across town, Edward wrestled with the same dilemma from another angle. Each day he resolved to speak, to tell Margaret openly that he loved her, that he would fight for her despite the world's scorn. And each day, fear bound his tongue. He feared not for himself, but for the ruin his love might bring upon her. His courage, so fierce in the square, withered in the cold glare of society. Eleanor and Samuel, though less visible in the scandal, felt its shadow creeping closer. Eleanor's maid whispered of servants' chatter. They say the Ashford daughter sneaks to meet someone. That if the Whitmore girl is disgraced, others will be next. Eleanor paled at the news. Samuel urged her to be strong. Let them whisper. Our truth belongs to us. But even as he spoke, he knew that whispers in London were like sparks in dry timber. They ignited quickly and consumed mercilessly. One rainy afternoon, Margaret ventured alone to the bookshop, seeking refuge in familiar shelves. As she ran her fingers over the bindings, a shadow fell beside her. Edward stood there, pale but resolute. Miss Whitmore, he said softly. Her heart leapt, but her voice trembled. Mr. Turner, you should not be here. And yet here I am, he answered, echoing the words Eleanor once spoke to Samuel. I could not remain silent any longer. Whatever the world says, know this. If I could bear the scandal alone, I would. If I could shield you from it, I would. But I cannot deny that the moment in the square was the truest of my life. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. And what future could we have, Edward? They would never permit it. You saw their faces at the ball. To them, you are a clerk, and I am a commodity. To me, he whispered fiercely, you are not a commodity. You are Margaret, and if I must fight the world, I will. Clara, watching from behind the counter, quickly turned her face away, pretending to rearrange volumes. But her heart raced with both dread and hope, for she knew that every forbidden word spoken that day tightened the knot of fate around them all. And beyond the bookshop's door, the city churned, carriages rattled, street sellers shouted, fog drifted low across the Thames. London remained vast and indifferent, but within its endless murmur, for young hearts beat with a rhythm that defied its cold machinery. The weight of rumor pressed upon them, but within that weight, something fierce and unyielding began to stir. The days that followed the Harrington Ball unfolded like a drama performed upon 100 stages, each actor unaware that they were part of the same play. London itself became a theater, every drawing room, tavern, an alleyway, a place where whispers were spoken, judgments passed, and destinies decided. In Belgravia, Lady Somerville relished her triumph. She held afternoon tea with her circle of confidants, recounting with relish the scandal of the season. Her voice dripped with false sympathy as she described the pale young woman at the center of the rumors. Poor Miss Whitmore, she sighed, pausing just long enough to let her listeners imagine disgrace. So charming, so full of promise, and now, well, you know how fragile a young lady's reputation can be. Her companions gasped, fanned themselves, and repeated her words at half a dozen tables the next day. Meanwhile, in the cramped alleys of Whitechapel, the story reached a different audience. Dock workers and washerwomen debated the tale with rough humor. A clerk saves a lady? About time one of ours got noticed. One man laughed. A woman scrubbing linen shook her head. Mark me, he'll pay for it. They don't let men climb walls built of gold. The others nodded grimly, knowing from experience how society punished those who stepped beyond their station. The newspapers, emboldened by public appetite, grew bolder with each edition. Columns speculated about the future of a certain young lady, once thought destined for a dazzling match, now overshadowed by indiscreet encounters. Satirical cartoons appeared, showing a young woman swooning in the arms of a faceless clerk, her pearls falling into the gutter. Margaret saw one of these sketches in a discarded paper and nearly tore it to shreds. Clara had to take it from her hands before she ruined it and raged at Mrs. Whitmore. Upon seeing the same cartoon, nearly fainted. We are undone, she cried, pacing the parlor with wild eyes. They are laughing at us, at you, Margaret. We must act at once. A proposal must be secured. A marriage announced. It is the only remedy. Margaret sat stiffly in her chair. To whom, mother? To some stranger willing to buy silence with vows? Do you call that remedy? Or is it another prison? Her mother glared. Better a prison than ruin. Do not be selfish. Think of your sister. Think of this family. But Margaret could not think of family or duty. She could only think of Edward's face as he pulled her from the path of death. That moment had become her anchor, proof that at least once, her life had held truth. Edward himself lived in a storm of contradictions. At the office, whispers pursued him like shadows. Green grew more venomous. You've gone and ruined her, Turner. Even if you never touch her hand, you've ruined her. That is what they'll say. Edward clenched his jaw but said nothing. His superiors regarded him with wary eyes, uncertain whether his newfound notoriety was liability or opportunity. On the streets, strangers sometimes pointed. Some called him the hero. Others muttered slurs about his presumption. One evening a group of young gentlemen blocked his path, their voices dripping with mockery. Perhaps you'll try to save one of our sisters' necks. You think yourself worthy of silk when you were born to wool. Edward's fists curled, but he forced himself past them, knowing that one blow would seal his downfall. Yet amidst the hostility, There were glimmers of respect. A dockside woman pressed an apple into his hand with a smile. "For the girl you saved," she said simply, before disappearing into the crowd. The gesture, small as it was, sustained him through nights of despair. Eleanor felt the scandal tightening around her like a net. At her father's dinner table, guests spoke openly of the Whitmore disgrace, laughing at the downfall of ambitious mothers and foolish daughters. Eleanor kept her face serene, but inside her soul rebelled. She excused herself early, retreating to her room where she wrote by candlelight. They destroy women with whispers, yet crown men for the same deeds. If this is honor, then I will have none of it. Samuel's anger burned more openly. Among his circle of reformist friends, the scandal became a rallying cry. "Do you not see?" he argued passionately. "They fear the breach of class. If love can cross the wall, then the wall itself crumbles." His friends cheered. But Samuel knew words in smoky taverns could not yet alter the iron bars of society. Still, he wrote essays, fiery pamphlets that he dared not sign, slipping them into newspapers under anonymity. His words spread quietly, seeds waiting for a storm to grow. Weeks stretched into months. Yet the rumor did not fade. Instead, it hardened into narrative. To some, Margaret was a figure of sympathy, a young woman cruelly trapped by society's hypocrisy. To others, she was reckless, a cautionary tale. To Edward, she remained a beacon, though one surrounded by storm died at last. Mrs. Whitmore arranged a dinner with a wealthy widower, hoping to secure a swift engagement. Margaret sat through the evening with frozen politeness, her heart absent. She heard his stories of estates and hunting dogs, but not a word touched her soul. When he spoke of taming a wife as one tames a horse, she nearly choked. That night, she stood at her window, looking over the fog-shrouded city. Somewhere out there, Edward walked the same streets. Somewhere, Eleanor and Samuel whispered their own defiance. The city hummed with secrets, but Margaret felt hers would soon explode. For London had made itself a stage, and the play was only half complete. What remained was the reckoning, when masks would fall, and truth, whether ruinous or redemptive, would stand revealed. London in spring was rarely gentle. The fog that rolled from the Thames seemed almost to carry voices within it, whispers of scandal, rumors of disgrace, and the heavy tread of judgment. The Whitmore household was besieged not by creditors or soldiers, but by visitors, gentlemen with practiced smiles, mothers with sharpened tongues, all arriving with the same intent, to evaluate whether Margaret could be salvaged, whether her name could be cleansed through the swift alchemy of marriage. On a Wednesday afternoon, Mr. Langley, a widower of 40 with 3 unruly children, arrived with his sister. Mrs. Whitmore welcomed them eagerly, fluttering like a moth around a candle. Margaret sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap. As Mr. Langley spoke of his estates in Sussex and his need for a steady hand to manage a household, his sister interjected often, praising his generosity, while Margaret forced polite smiles. Every word pressed upon her like a chain. When at last Mr. Langley hinted at beginning a new chapter together, Margaret excused herself abruptly and fled to her chamber. Mrs. Whitmore followed, her face pale with fury. "You will destroy us," she hissed. "Better destruction than a loveless prison," Margaret answered, her voice trembling but firm. The next morning, a newspaper lay upon the breakfast table with another cutting remark. "It is whispered that a certain young lady's family seeks an urgent alliance. Those suitors hesitate to bind themselves to a house shadowed by impropriety." Mrs. Whitmore crushed the paper in her fist, but the words hung in the air like smoke. Edward, meanwhile, faced his own torment. A letter arrived at his office, unsigned, written in an elegant but venomous hand. "Leave her be. You may think yourself noble, but you are dirt on a lady's shoe. Persist, and you will regret it. Men have vanished for less." Edward read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking. His colleagues noticed his pallor, but he tucked the paper into his coat and said nothing. That night, in his small room, He stared at the letter by candlelight. Part of him felt fear cold in his gut. Another part burned with rage. If they think threats will silence me, he whispered, then they know nothing of what it means to love. Eleanor's life, too, grew heavier under her father's scrutiny. Lord Ashford had begun to suspect her restlessness. You will attend Lady Beresford's soiree next week, he declared one evening. I have spoken to Lord Redmayne. He finds you agreeable. This will proceed. Eleanor bowed her head in silence, but her heart screamed. That night, she met Samuel in a shadowed alley, her cloak drawn tightly about her. They mean to barter me like a coin, she said bitterly. And if I resist, I fear what he may do. Samuel gripped her hands. Then we must act before they chain you. Let us flee. Tonight, tomorrow, whenever you choose. I have some savings. Enough for a modest start. Better poverty together than wealth apart. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. I am afraid, not of poverty, but of losing you. Every path seems barred. Samuel touched her cheek gently. Paths can be made, Eleanor. They are not given. They are carved at the same time. Samuel's anonymous writings began to catch notice. One pamphlet slipped into the hands of a printer, was reprinted and circulated widely. It spoke of hypocrisy in society, of walls between classes that served only to protect the idle rich, and of the courage of those who dared to love across those walls. Readers debated fiercely in coffee houses. Some dismissed it as radical nonsense. Others nodded in secret agreement. Eleanor read it in her chamber with trembling hands and whispered, "You have given me a voice." For Margaret, escape came only in small moments. Clara, ever perceptive, insisted on walks through the park, where the air at least felt freer than the suffocating parlor. You cannot let them break you, Clara said firmly. If you yield now, you will be theirs forever. Promise me you will fight. I promise nothing, Margaret replied, but her eyes softened with gratitude. Edward longed to see her again, but chance seemed cruel. Once, crossing a bridge, he caught sight of her carriage, her pale face framed by the window. For a fleeting second their eyes met, and though neither raised a hand, the world seemed to narrow to that single glance. It sustained him for days that London itself seemed to conspire in their fates. Carriages rattled over cobblestones, vendors shouted, factories belched smoke. Yet beneath the clamor, the city pulsed with hidden lives, secret hopes. In drawing rooms, the scandal of Margaret Whitmore still flickered like a flame refusing to die. In taverns, Samuel's words were repeated in hushed tones. In Eleanor's heart, rebellion grew daily. And in Edward's chest, determination hardened into steel. The city wore its mask of grandeur, but beneath it daggers glimmered, daggers of gossip, of threat, of desire. And sooner or later, someone would bleed. The weeks that followed were not measured in days or in church bells, but in whispers, letters, and the tightening grip of fear. The Whitmore household was like a besieged fortress. Every knock at the door carrying the possibility of salvation or ruin. One evening, as the gas lamps flickered outside, a second suitor arrived, Mr. Fenton, a man younger than Mr. Langley, but with a reputation that made Clara shiver. He was known for gambling, for debts hidden beneath his fashionable waistcoats, and for a temper that erupted like powder when crossed. Still, he came armed with roses and polished compliments. Mrs. Whitmore, desperate to secure her daughter's future, welcomed him eagerly. Margaret endured the conversation, her face pale, her voice subdued. Fenton spoke with ease about horse racing, about the thrill of risk, about a wife who must stand loyally beside her husband no matter what debts may come. Margaret's throat tightened. She realized, with a wave of horror, that her mother was considering him seriously. After he left, Margaret confronted her. You would sell me to a man who gambles away his fortune. Who shouts at servants? Who strikes his dog? Mrs. Whitmore's eyes flashed. Do not be dramatic. Better a man with flaws than no man at all. You think you are free to choose, Margaret. Freedom is a luxury only men enjoy. For us, survival depends on alliance. Margaret's voice broke into anger. Then I will not survive by your terms. I will not be bartered like a horse at auction. She fled the room, her tears burning as hot as her fury. In another part of the city, Edward was fighting his own battle. A second letter arrived, this one more direct. You are warned. You persist. Next time, it will not be words but fists. Stay away from her. The handwriting was the same, but the tone sharper, filled with venom. Edward read it by the light of a candle in his small room. His first impulse was fear, but then he felt a strange clarity. They are afraid of me, he realized. Afraid of what it means if she chooses me. The thought gave him strength. Still, he began to watch over his shoulder when he walked through the streets, wary of shadows. At the docks one evening, two men lingered longer than necessary, their eyes following him. Edward tightened his grip on his satchel, his heart pounding. He made it home safely, but the warning was clear. London itself was becoming hostile ground. Eleanor's prison was of a different kind. Lord Ashford had grown more controlling since the scandal. He forbade her late walks, ordered her to remain under the eye of her maid, and began to speak openly of an imminent engagement. Lord Redmayne will call next week, he announced over supper, carving his meat with cold precision. You will be gracious, Eleanor. This union will secure both our names. Eleanor pressed her lips together, too afraid to defy him openly. But inside her heart thundered. The night she met Samuel again, cloaked in shadows near the old churchyard. Rain dripped from the eaves, and the cobblestones gleamed black. They mean to force me, she whispered, clutching his hand. Then we cannot wait, Samuel replied. His voice trembled not with fear but with urgency. I have saved enough for passage, not far, but enough to start. We can go north or across the channel. They cannot control us once we are gone. Eleanor shook her head, torn. And my father, he will hunt us. He will call me ungrateful, mad, lost. Samuel cupped her face in his hands. He will call you many names, but you will be free. Do you not see, Eleanor? The world belongs not to those who keep us chained, but to those who break the chains. Her tears mingled with the rain. Then promise me, Samuel. Promise we will not wait too long. I promise, he said fiercely. Soon. Very soon. Meanwhile, Samuel's anonymous pamphlets spread further. Printers in Fleet Street whispered about the mysterious writer, who penned fiery words against society's hypocrisy. One pamphlet, titled On the Tyranny of Gossip, struck directly at the Whitmore scandal without naming it. They destroy women with whispers, yet crown men for cruelty. It read, they praise the wealthy for indulgence and condemn the poor for love. What is this but tyranny dressed as morality? Margaret herself came across the pamphlet in the bookshop, her hands trembling as she read. For the first time, she felt seen, as if someone understood her pain, though she did not know whose pen had given it voice. She pressed the paper to her chest and whispered, whoever you are, you speak my soul. The city grew restless as spring deepened. Demonstrations flared in poorer districts, workers shouting for fair wages. The wealthy spoke of unrest in tones of disdain, while the poor spoke of survival. Amid this turbulence, the private struggles of Margaret, Edward, Eleanor, and Samuel seemed both insignificant and monumental, a small story, yet one that mirrored the larger battle of freedom against chains. One Sunday, at church, Margaret endured the weight of 100 stares. The sermon, on the virtue of obedience, seemed aimed directly at her. When the service ended, she felt a hand brush hers. It was Edward, slipping past in the crowd. Their eyes met for only a second, but in that second she felt courage flood her veins. Later that night, Edward sat at his desk and finally began a letter he dared not destroy. It read, I do not know if I have the right to speak, yet silence is a greater sin. Whatever the world says, know that when I saw death coming for you, I did not think of scandal or propriety. I thought only that I could not live if you were gone. If that was wrong, then let me be guilty. For to save you was to save myself. He sealed the letter, but hesitated to deliver it. Still, the words existed now, written in ink, and that alone gave him strength. The storm gathered, each drop of rumor swelling into a flood. The Whitmores fought to preserve their name. Edward braced against threats. Eleanor and Samuel prepared to leap into the unknown. London pulsed like a great heart, indifferent to the lives it consumed. But beneath the glitter of chandeliers and the smoke of factories, rebellion stirred. And soon, very soon, the storm would break. London's heartbeat quickened as spring deepened into its restless peak. The air grew warmer, but the city seemed colder, every conversation charged with suspicion, every gaze sharpened like a blade. By now, the Whitmores' predicament was no longer confined to parlors and whispered corridors. It had become fodder for gossip at every level of society. Fishmongers at Billingsgate repeated the tale. Hackney drivers muttered it as they cracked their whips. And in the elegant drawing rooms of Mayfair, ladies murmured the story behind raised fans. For Margaret, each day was a test of endurance. She woke with dread, dressed with mechanical precision, and sat at the breakfast table as if awaiting judgment. One morning, her father brought news with grim satisfaction. Lord Redmayne has expressed renewed interest, he said, folding his newspaper with deliberate care. He is prepared to overlook recent indiscretions, provided you conduct yourself with humility. He will call upon us this evening. Margaret's stomach clenched. Redmayne was older than Fenton, with the kind of cruel arrogance that needed no proof beyond his eyes. He had a reputation for disciplining his household with harshness disguised as order. Margaret's voice trembled as she replied, "Father, I beg you." "No." He cut her off sharply. "There will be no begging. You will smile, you will charm, and you will restore what you have nearly destroyed. Tonight." The evening arrived like a sentence. Redmayne entered the parlor with the quiet confidence of a man who already owned what he desired. His eyes lingered on Margaret with a predator's patience. He spoke of his estates in Yorkshire, of the necessity of obedience within a household, and of his expectations of a wife. "My dear," he said at last, raising his glass, "I value loyalty above all, and loyalty, once given, must be unshakable. Do you understand?" Margaret nodded faintly, though her hands trembled in her lap. Clara, seated nearby, clenched her fists beneath her skirts. Her eyes flashing with rage she dared not express aloud. When Redmayne departed, Mrs. Whitmore practically glowed with triumph. "Do you see, Margaret? Redemption is within reach. You will thank us one day." Margaret retreated to her chamber and collapsed onto her bed, choking back sobs. In the silence, she whispered, "Better death than his chains." Elsewhere in London, Edward faced a different trial. He left his office late one night, the street slick with rain, when two men emerged from an alley. Their hats were pulled low, their steps quick and purposeful. "You're the clerk who thinks he can touch what's above him," one sneered. Before Edward could answer, a fist struck his jaw, sending him sprawling into the mud. He scrambled up, clutching his satchel like a shield. "Stay away from her," the second man growled. "This is your last warning." Another blow landed in his ribs before the men melted back into the shadows. Edward staggered home, his lip bleeding, his body aching. He collapsed onto his narrow bed, gasping, yet his pain throbbed through him. Another sensation burned brighter, defiance. "If they strike me for loving her," he whispered, "then every bruise is proof that love is stronger than their power." The following days blurred into survival. Edward continued his work by day, though his colleagues whispered about his bruises. At night, he wrote feverishly, letters to Margaret he dared not send, essays condemning the cruelty of the elite, reflections on what it meant to love in a world built to forbid it. Each word carved strength into his resolve. Eleanor's situation grew ever more precarious. Lord Ashford increased his surveillance, assigning the footman to accompany her walks and instructing her maid never to leave her side. Yet Eleanor found ways to slip free, if only for an hour. She and Samuel met in the hidden garden of an abandoned townhouse, its iron gate half rusted, its roses wild and untended. There, In stolen moments, they planned. Samuel spread a map upon a broken bench. We could take the North Road, reach Liverpool in 3 days if fortune favors us. There are ships sailing for America or even France. We would need false names, perhaps, but it can be done. Eleanor traced the map with trembling fingers. America, a world so far away it might as well be a dream. A dream, Samuel said, taking her hand. That becomes real the moment we choose it. Yet even in planning, doubt not at Eleanor. She imagined her father's rage, the scandal her flight would ignite, the burden she would place upon Samuel. If we go, she said softly, I lose my family. I lose everything I have ever known. You lose chains, Samuel replied, his eyes fierce. And you gain a life that is yours, not his. Meanwhile, Samuel's pamphlets spread like wildfire. Coffee houses buzzed with debate, apprentices passed them beneath counters, and even gentlemen secretly tucked them into their pockets. One fiery line began to circulate in whispers. A society that silences love is already crumbling. No one knew the author, but Edward, Margaret, Eleanor, and Clara each felt the words resonate differently in their hearts. Clara herself grew bolder. She confronted her mother one evening, her voice sharp as a blade. Why do you see only the danger of disgrace and never the danger of despair? Margaret is not a pawn in your game, mother. She is a human soul. Mrs. Whitmore recoiled, scandalized. You dare speak to me so? Yes, Clara replied steadily. I dare. Because someone must. Margaret overheard this exchange from the hallway. Tears welled in her eyes. But this time, they were not tears of helplessness. They were tears of gratitude, of renewed strength. She whispered, Thank you, Clara, though no one heard. The city itself seemed to mirror their turmoil. Processions marched through the streets demanding reform, their banners raised against corruption. Police dispersed them with batons, yet the voices only grew louder. Among the chaos, the struggles of free young souls wove themselves into the larger tapestry of unrest. Their defiance was but a thread, yet every thread mattered. One night, Margaret stood at her window, the moonlight casting silver across her face. She thought of Edward, bruised and threatened, yet unbroken. She thought of Eleanor, caught in her father's grasp yet planning escape. She thought of her own cage and whispered into the night, The storm is coming, and I will not hide. The day Lord Redmayne returned was announced like a royal procession. Servants polished every surface in the Whitmore household. The dining room table gleamed with silverware, and Mrs. Whitmore flitted about, instructing the maids with nervous energy. Margaret felt like a lamb prepared for slaughter. She stood in her chamber as Clara laced her gown, the corset pulling tighter than usual. You need not endure this, Clara whispered, her hands trembling as they tied the ribbons. What choice do I have? Margaret murmured, staring at her reflection. Her eyes looked hollow, as though the girl she had once been had already fled. The choice to say no, Clara replied fiercely. The choice to fight. Margaret touched her sister's hand briefly. A silent thank you, before descending the staircase into the glittering cage of her own parlor. Lord Redmayne arrived in a carriage drawn by black horses. He entered with calm authority, his gaze sweeping the room like a conqueror surveying his prize. Bowing slightly to Mr. Whitmore, he turned his attention directly to Margaret. My lady, he said smoothly, it is time we speak openly. Your family's honor wavers, but I am prepared to restore it. I will take you as my wife. The words fell like iron chains. Mrs. Whitmore gasped in delight, her eyes bright with tears. Mr. Whitmore nodded gravely, as though the matter were already settled. But Margaret stood frozen, her throat dry. She felt Clara's presence behind her, silent but strong, and in that moment something within her cracked. I cannot, she said, her voice trembling. The room fell silent. Redmayne's eyes narrowed, cold and calculating. You misunderstand, he said softly, though his tone was steel. This is not a request. This is a rescue. Refuse me, and your family's ruin will be complete. Margaret lifted her chin, surprising even herself. then let it be ruin. I will not chain my soul to a man I cannot respect, nor to one I cannot love." Mrs. Whitmore cried out as if struck. "Margaret, think of what you are saying." "I am thinking," Margaret replied, her voice firmer now. "For the first time, I am thinking for myself." Redmayne's mask cracked. He set down his glass with deliberate force. "You will regret this insolence," he said. "I do not forgive humiliation, and I do not forget." With that, he strode from the room, leaving the family in stunned silence. Upstairs, behind a locked door, Margaret collapsed into Clara's arms. "I have doomed us," she whispered. "No," Clara answered softly. "You have freed us." Double quotes. Meanwhile, across the city, Edward felt the weight of his own breaking point. He had barely recovered from the last attack when another came, this time in daylight. Two men followed him from his office, shoving him into a narrow alley. One pressed a knife against his side. "Final warning," the man hissed. "You keep away from her, or next time we carve your name into the river." Edward's fear flared, but so did his anger. "Do it, then," he said through clenched teeth. "Kill me. But understand this. You cannot kill what I feel for her, and you cannot kill the truth. Others will carry it, even if I fall." The men, unsettled by his defiance, pushed him hard against the wall and fled. Edward slid to the ground, shaking but alive. For the first time, he realized that silence was no longer an option. He returned to his small room, lit a candle, and began to write not letters to Margaret this time, but a manifesto. He wrote of love denied, of cruelty disguised as morality, of the injustice of power wielded against the weak. He poured his soul into the words until dawn broke over the rooftops. Eleanor, too, reached the edge of endurance. Her father announced at supper, "Lord Redmayne has suffered an insult, but I intend to mend it. Eleanor, you will accompany me to his estate next month. A union must be secured within this family, one way or another." Eleanor's spoon clattered against her plate. "You mean to trade me as compensation?" she said quietly. Lord Ashford's eyes blazed. "I mean to uphold our honor." "You will do as I command." Eleanor bowed her head in outward obedience, but inside she was on fire. That night, she sought Samuel with desperate urgency. "We cannot wait," she told him, clutching his hands beneath the shadow of the garden gate. "If I do not flee now, he will lock me in a prison of silk and gold. I would rather walk barefoot in mud at your side than wear a crown in his house." Samuel's heart swelled with fierce love. "Then tomorrow," he whispered, "meet me by the river docks at dusk. Bring nothing you cannot carry. From tomorrow on, we will belong to no one but ourselves." Eleanor nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "Tomorrow," she echoed, as though speaking the word could conjure freedom itself. London seemed to thrum with their defiance. Carriages rattled, bells rang, crowds jostled. But beneath the noise, a storm gathered momentum. Margaret had defied Redmayne. Edward sharpened his pen into a weapon. Eleanor and Samuel prepared to leap into the unknown. The city glittered like a stage set for tragedy, yet in the wings, rebellion waited to burst forth. The masks were cracking, the chains were breaking, and soon, there would be no turning back. The night Eleanor fled was thick with mist. London's lamps glowed dimly through the fog, their halos blurred like fading stars. She crept from her chamber with only a small bundle hidden beneath her cloak. Her hands trembled as she passed through the silent hall, every creak of the floorboards threatening to betray her. At the door, her maid stirred, half waking. Eleanor pressed a finger to her lips. "Sleep," she whispered, and for once, luck was with her. The girl drifted back into slumber. Outside, the city breathed with damp chill. Eleanor's heart thundered as she hurried through shadowed streets toward the river. At the appointed dock, Samuel waited, a satchel slung across his shoulder, his eyes fierce with both fear and hope. When he saw her, relief lit his face. He caught her hands. "You came," he whispered. "Did you doubt me?" Eleanor replied, her voice trembling with both terror and exhilaration. They moved quickly, weaving through alleys to avoid notice. But the riverfront was alive even at night, sailors shouting, crates being hauled, drunken men stumbling from taverns. Samuel guided her toward a vessel bound north. He had bribed a deckhand to let them aboard unseen. Yet as they neared the gangplank, a shout split the night. Lady Ashford. Eleanor froze. Two of her father's footmen emerged from the fog, lanterns swinging. Panic surged. Samuel pulled her hand. Run. They darted between stacks of cargo, hearts pounding. The footmen gave chase, their boots clattering on the cobblestones. Samuel shoved over a barrel, slowing them for a moment. But one of the pursuers lunged and nearly caught Eleanor's cloak. She tore free with a cry. At last they reached the ship. The deckhand, alarmed by the commotion, waved them up. Samuel boosted Eleanor aboard, then scrambled after her. The footmen shouted from the quay, but the ship's crew hauled the plank in haste. Ropes loosened, sails caught wind, and the vessel began to drift into the dark current. Eleanor collapsed against Samuel, gasping, tears streaming. "We made it," she whispered. "For now," Samuel answered, holding her close. "For now, we are free." But freedom was fragile. They had escaped one prison only to sail into uncertainty. Meanwhile, Margaret faced her own storm. After Redmayne's departure, her parents erupted. Her father struck the table with his fist. "You have shamed us beyond repair," he roared. Mrs. Whitmore's voice trembled with fury. "Do you understand what you have done? You spat on salvation." Margaret stood trembling, but she did not bow. "I spoke truth. I will not sell myself into misery." Her father's eyes burned. "Then you will rot in spinsterhood, dragging your sisters with you. Pray God they forgive you when no man dares to claim them." Clara rushed forward, standing between them. "Blame her if you must, but she has shown more courage than either of you. She has chosen dignity over chains. Can you not see that?" Her mother gasped, scandalized. "You dare?" "Yes," Clara cut in. "I dare." The argument raged until voices cracked. But Margaret felt something shift inside her, a seed of strength, small yet unshakable. For the first time, she no longer feared their anger. Across the city, Edward moved with determination. His bruises still ached, but his spirit blazed. He delivered his manifesto to a printer in Fleet Street, slipping it across the counter with trembling hands. The printer, a weary man with ink-stained fingers, skimmed the opening lines and raised his brows. "You'll cause a stir with this." "Sir, then let it stir," Edward replied. Within days, pamphlets flooded the streets. "On the chains of false virtue" became a phrase whispered in taverns, quoted in markets, and even debated in coffee houses where gentlemen sat behind clouds of smoke. Edward's words, fiery, unpolished, yet raw with truth, struck nerves. He wrote of women treated as property, of men hiding cruelty behind wealth, of love suffocated by society's hypocrisy. Margaret herself obtained a copy through Clara. As she read, her heart raced. The sentences seemed written from her soul, though she could not know they had flowed from Edward's pen. She pressed the paper to her lips, whispering, "Whoever you are, you see me." But others saw danger. Lord Redmayne read the pamphlet and recognized the barbs aimed at his kind. His rage was icy, deliberate. If the author is found, he told his steward, he will regret the day he first held a pen. And thus the storm swelled. Eleanor and Samuel drifted toward an uncertain horizon. Margaret stood defiant against her parents' wrath. Edward's words spread like fire through the city. Redmayne sharpened his vengeance. London itself seemed to shudder, as if aware that the fates of for young souls were about to collide with forces far greater than themselves. The fog thickened, the bells tolled, and beneath it all the pulse of rebellion beat stronger with every hour. Lord Redmayne was not a man to suffer humiliation quietly. When the pamphlets began to spread through the streets, he recognized the sting of their words immediately. They crown men for cruelty and destroy women for whispers. It was as if the ink itself accused him. His pride, already wounded by Margaret's defiance, twisted into something darker. He summoned his steward, his voice low and icy. "Find the author. He hides behind anonymity, but no mask can last forever. Search the printers, the coffee houses, the bookstalls. I want his name. It did not take long. In Fleet Street, a careless apprentice, eager to boast, let slip that a certain young clerk brought writings at night. The rumor reached Redmayne within days. He smiled, thin and cruel. "Edward Hale," he murmured. So the worm dares raise his head. Margaret heard of Redmayne's search before Edward did. Clara rushed into her chamber, her cheeks flushed. "He knows," Clara gasped. "Redmayne knows, and he means to crush him." Margaret's blood ran cold. For days she had devoured the pamphlets in secret, sensing the soul behind the words but never daring to believe it was Edward. Now the truth struck her like lightning. "It was him," she whispered. "All along. It was him." That evening, she slipped from the house despite her parents' vigilance. Cloaked and veiled, she moved through the fog until she reached Edward's modest lodging. She knocked with trembling hands. When he opened the door, bruised but unbroken, she felt her heart both shatter and mend in the same instant. "You," she breathed. "Margaret," he whispered, as if the name itself was a prayer. For a moment, they simply stared at one another, the silence thick with everything left unsaid. Then Margaret stepped forward, her hands clutching his. "You risked everything for me. Every word you wrote. It was me you spoke for." Edward shook his head. "Not only you. For every woman silenced, for every man crushed by pride and power. But yes, Margaret, it was you who gave me the courage." Her tears fell freely now. "Then know this. I would rather face ruin with you than riches with him." He pulled her close, and for the first time, their lips met, not in scandal or secrecy, but in defiance of a world that would rather see them apart. Yet even in that moment of triumph, shadows gathered. A neighbor passed by the window, and Edward knew word would spread. Redmayne's net was tightening. Far from London, Eleanor and Samuel faced a storm of a different kind. The ship that had carried them north was caught in a violent gale. Waves crashed like mountains, tossing the vessel as if it were a toy. Sailors shouted, ropes snapped, and the deck pitched beneath their feet. Eleanor clung to Samuel, soaked to the bone, terror etched across her face. "Will we die here?" she cried above the roar. Samuel held her tightly. "No, not while I breathe." Hours passed in chaos. At last the storm eased, leaving the ship battered but afloat. The dawn broke gray and cold. Eleanor leaned against Samuel, exhausted but alive. "We survived," she whispered, wonder in her voice. "Yes," he said, "and every breath now is ours, not theirs." Back in London, Redmayne made his move. 2 men were dispatched to seize Edward, not for a duel of honor, but for a lesson in fear. Edward knew they would come. He had only hours to decide, flee or fight. But when Margaret, still veiled, returned to him and said, "Whatever comes, I will not abandon you," he felt his decision. On the 4th night, the knock came, not gentle, not polite, but heavy, insistent. Margaret, who had insisted on staying despite the risk, grasped his arm. "It is them," she whispered. Edward looked at her, her face pale but resolute. "If they take me, you must go." "No." She cut him off, her eyes blazing. "Not this time. Whatever happens, I stand with you." The door burst open. 2 men surged inside, followed by the cold shadow of Lord Redmayne himself. He stepped into the room with the calm cruelty of a hunter who believes the prey already trapped. "So," Redmayne said, his gaze flicking from Edward to Margaret, the little clerk, and the fallen daughter. "How poetic. Did you think your scribbles could wound me?" Edward straightened, though his heart pounded. "Not scribbles, truth, and the truth has teeth sharper than your threats." Redmayne's smile was thin. "You speak bravely for a man about to be crushed." Margaret stepped forward. "If you mean to crush him, you crush me as well. I will not marry you. I will not bend to you, and I will not allow you to silence him for a moment." The room was silent but for the hiss of the dying candle. Then Redmayne's mask cracked. He lunged, not with words but with violence, seizing Edward by the collar. The men moved to restrain him, but Margaret cried out and grabbed at Redmayne's arm. In the struggle, the table overturned, paper scattering like startled birds. "You think yourself a man," Redmayne snarled at Edward, his fist raised. "You are nothing." Edward, fueled by desperation, struck back. The blow landed squarely, and Redmayne staggered, his lip bleeding. The sight was shocking. The untouchable lord brought low by the clerk he despised. The two men hesitated, suddenly unsure. Redmayne shouted, "Seize him!" But his command lacked the old power. Margaret's voice rang louder. "Do not touch him. You see the truth. He is the stronger man, not you." Neighbors, roused by the noise, crowded the street outside. Faces appeared at the window. Whispers spread. Redmayne, fighting in the room of a clerk. Redmayne, bloodied. What had been rumored now became spectacle. Redmayne, realizing too late the danger, spat in fury. "This is not over." He stormed from the room, his men trailing behind him. The damage, however, was done. The scandal was no longer Margaret's. It was his. Edward collapsed into a chair, breathless. Margaret knelt beside him, her hands trembling on his. "You faced him," she whispered, "and you won." "No," Edward said softly. "We won, together." Far away, Eleanor and Samuel faced their own reckoning. After days at sea, battered by storms and hunger, the ship docked at a small northern port. The land before them was bleak, gray with mist, but it was land, and it was free. Eleanor stood on the shore, her cloak whipping in the wind. "We made it," she said in wonder. Samuel took her hand. "Not just to land, Eleanor, to life. Whatever waits, it will be ours." They walked forward, to shadows vanishing into the mist, but stronger than any chains left behind. Back in London, the Whitmore household simmered with ruin and rebirth. Mrs. Whitmore raged, declaring Margaret lost. But Clara answered with fire. "She has saved herself," she said, "and she has saved us." Though you will not admit it, even Mr. Whitmore, silent and brooding, could not deny the tide turning. Redmayne's humiliation spread like wildfire. While whispers of Edward's courage took root in coffee houses, men repeated the tale. The clerk who defied a lord, the woman who chose love over fear. In alleys, pamphlets still changed hands. The city that had fed on gossip now fed on truth. One evening, Edward and Margaret walked together by the river. The fog curled low, lanterns flickered, and the water whispered against the stones. Margaret leaned against him, her voice steady. "The world may never forgive us." "Then let it not," Edward replied. "We did not live for their forgiveness. We lived for this, for love, for dignity, for the right to breathe without chains." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the truth of it settle deep within her. The path ahead would not be easy. Scandal, poverty, uncertainty. But it would be theirs. The storm had raged, and in its wake came silence, not of defeat, but of possibility. Years passed, and London changed as all cities do. Gas lamps grew brighter, factories spread further, and new scandals replaced the old in endless rotation. Yet for those who had lived through it, the storm of Margaret Whitmore, Edward Hale, Eleanor Ashford, and Samuel Carter was never forgotten. Edward and Margaret did not vanish into obscurity as many predicted. They married quietly, without grandeur, in a modest chapel on the edge of the city. No noble guests attended, no chandeliers blazed, only Clara, steadfast and loyal, stood with them. Poverty pressed close in the early years. Edward continued as a clerk. Margaret managed their small home with skill she had never been taught, but quickly learned. There were nights when bread was scarce, when rent seemed impossible, when the whispers of society still stung. Yet in their house, lit by a single candle, laughter was more frequent than tears. Margaret often said, "We lost their world, Edward, but gained our own." And he would answer, "Then ours was the better bargain." In time, Edward's writings found wider recognition. What began as pamphlets grew into essays into books. His words, once hunted, became quoted. He never forgot the bruises, the threats, the night Redmayne stormed into his room. Those scars became the ink of his convictions. Margaret, though never fully forgiven by her family, built a new family of her own. She bore children who grew up not in ballrooms but in gardens, not taught to bow but to speak with honesty. And though her name was long absent from society pages, in quieter corners she was spoken of with admiration. The woman who had defied a lord and chosen love, Clara, too, carved her own path. Refusing to be bartered, she remained by Margaret's side, eventually becoming a teacher in a small school. She taught young girls not only letters and numbers, but also courage to think, to question, to choose. That is for Eleanor and Samuel. Their journey carried them far from London. They reached America after months of hardship, their savings nearly gone, their bodies weary. But in that wide, untamed land, they found freedom. They built a modest farm, worked side by side beneath a sky vast and unbroken. To their neighbors they were simply Eleanor and Samuel, husband and wife, no lord's daughter, no servant's son. Only two souls bound together, sometimes on quiet evenings. Eleanor would walk to the edge of their fields and look west, the horizon painted with fire by the setting sun. She would remember the fog of London, the weight of her father's commands, the fear of being trapped forever. Then she would smile and whisper, "We're free." Samuel would join her, taking her hand, and together they would watch the light fade, their hearts unburdened. And what of Lord Redmayne? His reputation never recovered. The image of him, bloodied in a clerk's room, clung to him like a curse. Whispers followed him through every drawing room. Business faltered, allies grew scarce, and though he remained wealthy, he was no longer respected. His power waned, until he became a figure spoken of with ridicule rather than fear. History did not record these lives in grand chronicles. There were no statues, no portraits in gilded halls, but in coffee houses, in kitchens, in whispered tales passed down, their choices lived on. People remember that a young woman had defied obedience, that a clerk had struck a lord, that two lovers had fled across the sea to carve out freedom. The storm had broken, yes, but in its ashes had come dawn, and the dawn lit not only their lives, but the lives of those who dared, afterward, to choose love over fear, truth over silence, freedom over chains.